This is important. A second step, you have protection from the ApoBec proteins that are there to kind of bring you into balance with genetic information flowing in. But once you preserve some of that information, the ApoBec proteins decide not to degrade some genetic information coming in from the virome. There's lots of other steps involved. It's now considered the most complicated, most highly regulated step in human biology is RNA ribosomal biology. And so the ribosome is the big enzyme that turns RNA genetic information into proteins. So the only way that a virus can proliferate its information is through this ribosomal information. And we now know that this is one of the most highly regulated, carefully controlled mechanisms, which again protects us from overproduction of viral information, but also protects us from inappropriate expression of our own genes. And so to do this, there's more than 79 ribosomal proteins that are now needing to be understood to be needed to be present around that ribosome before it can function. And there's another 200 proteins like helicases and the rest that have to be reduced to allow for the RNA to occur. So we have co-activators and co-suppressors around the ribosomal RNA mechanism to create that first proliferation of a viral information stream or a genetic information stream coming out of our nucleus. And so I want to show you this level of complexity to reassure you that there is no such thing as a virus that can leap in and attack a healthy human body and take over its machinery. The only way in which we come into an abnormal relationship with a virus is if we've had massive breakdown of signaling and communication and balance mechanisms within the cell. And so when we say somebody is dying from a viral syndrome, what we're really saying is this person is dying because they've had a fundamental destruction of thousands of pathways within the human body that should have kept them in balance with the ecosystem around them and the virome of communication that's coming into their bodies. So as we start to think of that human body as this extraordinary, beautiful balance of organic garden communicating through this viromic milieu of information, I want us to take a look at our current response to COVID. These are images from the last few months of us spraying these toxins that damage DNA. Since they're not living organisms, we have to spray toxins that are carcinogens. A carcinogen is something that accelerates genetic injury. So we're spraying carcinogens into our atmospheres up and down streetways and through park systems and right on to people coming off their airplanes. We've repurposed farm equipment, fire equipment. We've actually, in Switzerland, they've repurposed snow-making machines to spray billions of gallons of these things in the air. It's truly astounding that we have, in the advent of yet another pandemic, we have decided to fight harder instead of accept the reality that our biology is failing for our isolation from this nature, for our isolation from the adaptive information, the updates coming out of the virome. We've put ourselves in opposition. It's a stunning mistake that we continue to make over and over again. As we start to imagine spraying all of these antimicrobials and genetic, damaging stuff into the environment, we need to take, careful look at what we're going to do to the cancer epidemic over the next couple of years after exposing the human population in cities to this level of damage. This study is showing the exact mechanisms by which cancer moves from a tumor to a metastatic disease that kills a woman, and it's through the loss of the methylbacterium radiotolerans. That is a adaptive protective mechanism around that human tumor. And so it's interesting to realize that without the microbiome, we don't have adaptation and immune system function to even fight tumors. And so as we increase the herbicide pressure, as we increase the antiseptic pressure on our environment, we're inherently going to accelerate cancer and other autoimmune conditions and other conditions of kind of cell-cell communication breakdown. And so it's a sad, sad day for humanity as we see ourselves in continued opposition instead of as the result of our nature. Cancer mortality, many of you have seen these, but we can show state by state that the more antibiotic we pour into the environment, the more cancer death we see. And so these are the numbers that start to get me scared. And of course, the cancer mortality has really been focused over the last 10, 15 years in the South. And so I want you guys to watch these cancer maps in the next couple of years with me to really keep an eye on things, because I think we're going to see a huge explosion of cancer in New York, areas of California, Seattle, other hotspots of COVID. I'm expecting to see marked increases in cancer death over the next few years as we realize the correlation between our antimicrobial process and that. Glyphosate obviously being that common antimicrobial, I do want to remind you of its mechanism as it kind of enters our environment, both the food system, the water system, and now our air and rain systems all carrying this chemical, is devastated, of course, the Midwest where we spray this molecule, and it's kind of led to this epicenter of cancer death down south. But I want to look across, all of the diseases for a moment and realize that, the leukemias that are all being sued for right now against Bayer, Monsanto, are just the tip of the iceberg. Bladder cancers on the right took off at the exact same time, 1992. Thyroid cancers, I'm sorry, this is slightly off the screen. Liver cancer, same pattern there. And you don't have to look at just cancers, but here's senile dementia. Look at 1990. We're on a slow increase with when adapted for age, you show almost no change in the prevalence of these neurologic conditions like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's dementia. But suddenly in 1992, we leave the population-adjusted green line, and we start to see this exponential rise in neurologic loss of memory. And again, we're going to go into a lot more detail with Dr. Pete Cummings on this, but there's a striking relationship between neurologic memory and retroviruses and RNA virus transcription. And so I'm pointing to these maps to show you again and again, in 1992, as we started to spray wheat directly with glyphosate for the first time, we fundamentally changed our relationship to the world around us. And we now know that viruses start to overexpress themselves in environments of cancer as well. So cancer is another sign of dysregulation of the innate immune system, as are a rise in viral transcription within us. And so when we see virome rising, when we see cancer rising, we can be very confident that we undermined innate immunity in the 1990s. And we did that in 92 with wheat, and 96 with corn, soybean, alfalfa, ultimately sugar beet, and 30 other species of commodity crops now all being sprayed with this chemical. We have to really look at the relationship between innate immunity. And if you look up innate immune system, the very first thing that you're going to find there is the barriers, or the first mechanism by which we do innate immunity. And as you've seen in many of my other lectures, glyphosate breaks apart our tight junctions. It breaks apart the gut membrane, the blood-brain membrane, and the kidney tubules, so that we're leaky sieve all over the place, the vascular tree, etc. So we turn into this leaky, barrier-free kind of milieu, and we no longer have that first mechanism of innate immunity or relationship to the virome as we lose those boundaries. So I really think that we'll find again and again that where we find high spraying of these pesticides, we will see high emergence of viromic information as we break down the innate immune system, not just of humans, but of the entire adaptive biology of mammals, or think of the protein industry and the like. So this is looking at the glyphosate spraying map across the world. Look at the amount of prevalence that you have in Hubei province in the center of China here is thought to be the highest spraying environment now in the world of glyphosate-containing herbicides. The chemical came off patent in 2002 and then again in 2007 to a bigger degree. And since then, China has made the majority of glyphosate-containing herbicides. We're all suing Monsanto and all of that, but in fact, every single chemical company in the US as well as in China is making some herbicide with a glyphosate compound within it. And so it's extraordinary prevalence now of this chemical. But now look at Europe, where you see the highest uses are in Italy. And if I had the map right now, actually I don't think I have next, to zoom in on Italy, you'll see that the highest concentrations in all of Italy are in northern Italy. So very specific to where we saw high penetrance of COVID, we see these high spots. This is looking at pork production now instead of glyphosate spraying. So now imagine the pigs of Asia. Asia is the highest density of pork production in the world, and Hubei province happens to be its highest concentration in all of China. And so you have now mammals in the form of pigs that are being raised on intense antibiotic exposure through their feed and high levels of glyphosate spraying in the environment. This is why influenza every year starts in Asia here, is because we are creating this level of extinction stress on the virome and biology within China to force this massive adaptation, gain of function effort every single year as we put this level of stress. Should we blame the communist government of China? In my book, absolutely not. What we've done as a globe is we've exported all of our most toxic manufacturing and cheap meat production and the rest to China. It's our consumer behavior that has made China the toxic, epicenter of the planet. And we should not be surprised, and China should not be personally held responsible or individually held responsible for the crisis that we have with all the viromic stress that we're producing. That is a collective consumer behavior. That is not a Chinese problem. That is a global problem. That is a global behavior that creates this type of environment within China. If we change our consumer behavior, we can radically change China. This is coming back to something I pointed out earlier, is that viruses have been circulating the planet since the beginning of multicellular, animals, let alone humans. We have had a long-standing spread of viruses around the planet to allow genomic adaptation and biodiversity to occur. With plant life, animal life, human life, none of it would have occurred without the ability of viruses to travel the world. They travel through the air as a primary mechanism. The droplets that everybody's putting their masks on and talking about, and 3 feet away, 6 feet away with social distancing, that only controls for droplet spread of a virus. That is pertinent in the first 2 to 4 weeks of a pandemic. But within that 4 to 8 week period, the virome has now traveled the world through aerosol and through aerial delivery, not through droplet delivery. And so now the only way in which droplets become pertinent is if you have an unhealthy enclosed environment where the droplets can really change the amount of viromic information. And so this is like if you have very close contact with a single individual over a 5-day period, your chance of being exposed to that virus increases some. Interestingly, we've seen almost zero transmission in the hospital settings, even though we can find the virus in the air ducts of hospital systems in China and in Italy and the U.S. Those studies have shown that the virus is traveling through aerosols, but we see very little prevalence of any signs of infection or reinfection within hospital systems, which suggests to all of us who've been reading the data that it takes a very high concentration of this coronavirus before we start to adapt any signs of imbalance with it. So it takes a very high delivery mode. So you need a whole lot of this in one space. Droplets can do that. So if you're around somebody and you're there sustained and you're able to breathe in enough of that, that may be enough for you to become ill. So the germ theory kind of holds up in a very small microsystem. But walking by somebody in public or walking in and out of a restaurant, your chance of getting this thing appears to be zero. Even walking in and out of a hospital room with somebody who has COVID has not been a single case recorded that virus can transfer through that infectious process. So the germ theory doesn't hold up with casual contact or short-term contact. It takes, your roommate or your family member with high levels. And even in that setting, 50% of people in that room will never have an abnormal relationship to that virus. They will never mount a fever. They will never have any symptoms. They'll find their viromic innate immune system balanced with that virus input, and they'll take that adaptive information and move forward with their biology, being more resilient in the future. A small percentage of people within that home will express symptoms on some level or otherwise. If you see high symptoms occurring within a family, it would suggest that that family's environment is so damaged that it's expressing this high level of imbalance with the virome. And so it's the food environment, it's the nutrient environment, it's the air environment of that home, rather than the presence of the virus, that will predict the outcomes for that extended family. And so I want you guys to all realize that when we think that we're seeing an epicenter of germs, we're probably seeing an epicenter of dysfunctional biology. We're seeing an epicenter of lack of health created by a lifestyle and an environment that created the vulnerability to that abnormal relationship with the virome in the first place. And so when we start to see these maps of Microsoft, and this is how the virus spread from this point to this point because this airplane traveled here and there, that is bogus. And then all the way down to the microscopic level, that is not how things are happening. We have a viromic event happening on the planet. The virus is real. I believe that. And I actually not even that terribly concerned. Is it made by a military lab, or is it naturally occurring from pig stool? I think it's probably naturally occurring from the environment. But even if in the worst case scenario, if it's manufactured in some gain of function lab, military lab somewhere, at this point it's irrelevant. We had the pandemic, it escaped. We should have been able to keep very good communication with that, balance with that virus no matter what, and most of us did. If it was a government attack, they certainly didn't figure out how to get by the innate immune system, which is reassuring. Okay, and so the innate immune system in the population of the world survived and worked. It functioned. The number of deaths, as you've seen the CDC revise this recently, is down to just 9,000 in the United States that were purely due to the presence of COVID, as far as they can tell. All the other deaths, that 25% of the millions on the planet now, those cases occurring in the United States that led to mortality were from comorbid conditions, mostly cardiovascular disease, diabetes, end-stage renal disease, and the like. And so those mortalities can't really be presented to blamed on the virus, because they were pre-existing conditions. They died of those conditions, perhaps exacerbated by the virus somewhere in the mix. But to say that the people are dying from the virus is inaccurate. They're dying of their comorbidities, and so the CDC rolls that number from hundreds of thousands back to maybe 9,000. And so a very small number of actual deaths happening in COVID in the United States. But again, we need to acknowledge that that in and of itself is not a symptom of a bad virus. It's a symptom of a bad deficiency in innate immune function. So thank goodness the immune system is as good as it is. I'm actually kind of shocked when I heard there was a new coronavirus, and I'm thinking about, wow, how much more unhealthy are we now than we were in 2012 when we last saw a big coronavirus pandemic with MERS. I was fully expecting it to be worse than it was. And in those early days, I was relieved to see China, Italy, and the rest not express this thing to the full potential that it could be. If we do not change direction, and if we keep spraying herbicides and sterilizing our environment, the next pandemic is going to be worse, because we're undermining innate immunity. And I won't care if it's a government lab or a naturally occurring virus again. The genomic updates have to keep happening, because we're putting an extinction level stress on the planet. It's going to happen. So this is just a reminder that we've had evidence of airborne transmission, not respiratory droplet transmission, since as far back as 2002, 2004 here with SARS. This is a demonstration of how viruses travel. They deposit in atmospheric boundary levels. They travel in very high atmosphere, and they travel bound to particulate. And the particulate they bind to is PM2.5, the carbon particulate that we produce through our energy and transportation industries. Produces this tiny little carbon particulate called PM2.5, which stands for particulate matter at 2.5 microns. And so, and it takes a very small amount of this thing. Micrograms per cubic meter are expressed here in this map. For every cubic meter of air, for every microgram of material present, we see an increase in mortality. And so what you're going to find out with COVID is that we can map PM2.5 to every single hotspot that occurred. And we can map that to the traffic of that carbon material around the planet. And so again, you were told that somebody developed this in Hubei and traveled by plane to Italy and maybe Seattle, and these were the initial cases due to human transfer. But I want you to show you what happens every single year, starting in September. This is September 29th. This is NASA data looking at carbon. And I want you to watch what happens as we move through here. There we go. So this is now November. Now we see the first cases. This is December. This is all the way to May and June. And now you see a reverse of the curve towards the end of the year. So I'm going to start and pause it here. So November, October, November, December. And so you're seeing this jump over and over again. So these are the early months of the transfer. And there's this plume of carbon material coming across from China to hit the west coast of the US. And you see a plume of carbon material leaving New York and heading over here to Asia. And you see another plume from Asia heading into, from Europe heading into Asia. So we create these plumes of carbon material that then seed the next location with whatever material, whatever genetic information is binding to PM2.5, the virus is binding to that carbon, will carry the information. So we should have seen first cases in Seattle and New York across this northern hemisphere. As you watch this day to day, week to week transfer across the northern hemisphere, we should have seen very little cases through the south. So Los Angeles should have had far less cases than San Francisco and the like in those early phases. But as the year goes on, you see that the northern hemisphere starts to clear, and it sweeps back across the midline of the near the equator. And so then we should have seen southern cases. And so that's exactly what happened in the United States. We saw the swath across the top, and then it swings back down and hits Florida just a month ago, and then Texas, and then LA, and Hawaii now getting it. And so as that reversal of the curve happens late in the season, we'll see it. So we should have been able to warn cities in the northern part of the United States that you'll see a high prevalence for a short period of time of corona prevalence, and then it's going to dissipate, and then we'll see it swing back through towards the end of the season, sweeping through the southern United States. All of that was predictable through carbon particulate and the way in which we understand viruses to be able to bind PM2.5 and travel in abnormal clumps. Before all this carbon material that humans were making, viruses dispersed themselves very equally through the atmosphere. There was not this like high concentration effect. Now we've created high concentration effects, and so the pandemics are starting to map not to the viral transfer around the world, but to the viral transfer and the concentration of PM2.5, particulate matter that can abnormally clump this stuff so that when you take a breath, you're not getting a few viruses. Every cell could be seeing thousands of viruses. And so we can overwhelm the innate immunity or the ApoBec3A proteins and everything else because of our abnormal exposure rate, because of our abnormal viral load on the particulate matter of the PM2.5. These are, again, hot spots. Again, in the end, we'll be able to track that this pandemic followed in cities that were very hot in PM2.5. I do want to show here that glyphosate has a huge impact on PM2.5. And so, again, Mississippi River Valley that I showed you early is encompassing this whole area, which obviously is not our big cities. We're not creating a bunch of carbon through municipal transportation and energy. Instead, we're creating the carbon out of decay and of fungal content within the soils and destruction of soil systems, as well as plant matter. Through the constant herbicide pressure, we're creating this massive carbon load in this environment. You'll remember that Louisiana was an outlier. So at the beginning of the pandemic, when the northern United States was becoming affected by the transfer of the genetic information, early on in February, New Orleans was an unusual hotspot. New Orleans is the end of the Mississippi River and is the highest concentrations of glyphosate throughout the world, and so has the most compromised innate immunity in the world. Happens to be Cancer Alley from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, that last 90 miles of the Mississippi, happens to be the highest rates of cancer in the entire developed world. Also was an epicenter of early on vulnerability, even when very small amounts of carbon should have been present there early in. But we saw, Florida was much more resilient. Florida and Southern California and Texas, these spots didn't come into influence until you saw the recirculation of PM2.5 across the South in June, July. And so with that late transfer, we should have seen New Orleans light up. So New Orleans lit up months before they should have, because of this devastating effect of glyphosate on PM2.5 prevalence, as well as the innate immune system breakdown.